I am Wombat McStiffens, and this is my presentation on the audacity of cats. I will start with my three proposals. The first is cats don't respect us. The second is they should. And the third is we need to do something about it. Throughout my presentation, I will provide evidence for each of these one at a time. I won't harp too long on my first proposal because I think it is well understood. Here are some statistics on cat attacks. In the top right, we have some recent headlines outlining cat attacks. And in the bottom right, we have images of attacks that went viral. I will try to summarize the common themes behind these attacks. I think this is best done by looking at the 5 W's of the attacks. Who are these attacks performed on? The answer in almost all instances is a caretaker of the cat. Please keep in mind that these are the individuals who place adequate time, copious amounts of money, and affection into these cats' lives to provide the cats with a quality of life they would not otherwise have. What is happening here? Obviously an attack, but this can be broken down into much more concerning details. These attacks are all too often a full-on surge of aggression, or an all-out attack. With this implication comes a complete lack of concern for the outcome of the victims. Listed are some of these potential outcomes. When can these attacks happen? Most attacks are during the daytime, but cats have been known to lay awake at night watching their owners. Many caretakers have even woken up to their cat lying on their face. Are these instances of failed suffocation attempts? Where do these attacks happen? This is best explained by the on-site phenomenon. Rapper Corrupt was an early proponent of this idea as referenced in the excerpt provided. And lastly, why do these attacks happen? This is the question that matters most. None of the evidence we have points to any provocation by the owner. When we take the carelessness and tenacity referenced in the other 4 W's into account, the only conclusion we can come to is cats do not respect us. This is clear and rather obvious. We will approach the real value of this presentation as we progress through the remaining proposals. Justin Tucker is a kicker for the Baltimore Ravens of the NFL. On September 26, 2021, he kicked a 66-yard field goal to beat the Detroit Lions. Using some physics, along with a few assumptions, we can do our best to determine the velocity with which Tucker kicked the ball. There's the kick. In sparing the math, our kick velocity comes out to 24.86 meters per second. We can now work to apply the math to our situation by asking, how far would Justin Tucker kick a cat, also known as Project Kick Cat? We can use the approximate mass of a pro football as well as that of a cat to work backwards and calculate the velocity of a cat kicked with the same force used by Tucker on his 66-yard field goal. The calculated velocity of 2.58 meters per second, along with the assumed 45-degree kick angle, can then be used to calculate the distance of the hypothetical kicked cat. The calculated distance of the hypothetical kicked cat comes out to 0.68 meters. An approximate trajectory of the hypothetical kicked cat can be compared to that of the football here. As you can see, the results of the calculations were underwhelming. The original results of Project Kit Kat were extremely disappointing to me, and I quickly labeled the project as a failure. In the time following the original results, I performed multiple bouts of self-reflection. I eventually came to the realization that great men persist. This clarity was provided only after reviewing the stories of some of the great men in human history, including Thomas Edison, who is known just as well for his handling of failure as he is for his successes, and George Washington Carver, who invented peanut butter despite racism. Women also. It was only after this time that I decided Project Kit Kat must not die. But the math was sound. I could not change my results. For it to continue, I needed to adapt, to think outside the box, and to find a new direction. I obsessed over the idea for days and nights at a time until I had my breakthrough. I've been thinking about it wrong the entire time. Cats and footballs, footballs and cats, they're nothing alike. For one, cats have a larger frame. They have much more volume. Even more, cats are much less bouncy than footballs. I realized that I needed to get away from the hypotheticals and go take action. I needed to go kick a cat. I developed a plan, and I had to answer some questions first to do so. I needed a cat. This led me to the first question. Would I experiment on a cat corpse or a living cat? To answer this question, I weighed the pros and cons. Experimenting on a living cat would provide me with the most realistic data. That was certainly a huge upside. On the other hand, a short bout of research provided me with an abundance of examples of the extent of trouble I could get into by kicking a living cat. On top of this, a history of animal cruelty is the most well-known connecting factor amongst many of the most infamous serial killers in U.S. history. Getting caught kicking a live cat would surely have the FBI invading my privacy for the rest of my life. A dead cat wouldn't provide me with data as reliable as the alternative, but the ease of setting up the project and the dampened potential repercussions eventually led me to choose it as my option. Once I had made my decision, I needed to figure out where I could attain a dead cat. I eventually decided the dumpster behind the animal shelter near my house was the most reasonable place to look. The rest of the plan was obvious: perform the experiment and make sure to get it on video for in-depth research. Now for the results. My plan to obtain a dead cat turned out to be foolproof. The options in the animal shelter dumpster were numerous, and after a few minutes of shuffling, I came away with a cat corpse that I felt was an accurate representation of the average cat. The experimental process was highly effective as well. My setup was easy, as I expected. I performed the experiment in my backyard to avoid having to clean up too much. I teed up the dead cat at an appropriate kicking height and performed one swift kick to the middle of its body, just as planned. Recording the results of the experiment can best be described as a roller coaster of events. I refer to this as the incident. The actual recording process went very well. I was able to review the recording right after the experiment and everything lined up. The problems in this area of the process were due to external factors. Unknowingly to me at the time, my neighbor was a witness to my experiment via her second floor window. Unfortunately, she had a reactionary response that lacked respect for the context of my experiment. She called the police on me, and whatever she said convinced them to show up no more than 4 minutes after the conclusion of my experiment. I explained with great clarity the nature of my experiment to the police, but this was to no avail. I was put in the back of their vehicle and jailed without bail. I was sentenced to 6 months in prison, and my video of the experiment was confiscated. The sentence would have been 25 years if the cat was alive, so I really dodged a bullet there. My sentence was eventually shortened to 3 months on the contingency that I see a psychiatrist once a week. I've seen Dr. Jeffries 4 times now. He always asks me if I still think about kicking cats, and I always give him the same answer. I don't need to think about it anymore now that I know what happens. I've designed a reenactment of the experiment to take the place of the lost footage. Here we have what will serve as our cat. And here we have a representation of the standard walking shoe I used for the experiment. I then delivered a kick into the midsection of the cat as shown here. And the result of the kick is depicted to the far right. Project Kick Cat provided strong evidence that kicking a dead cat hard in the midsection breaks it in half. It is certainly reasonable to make assumptions based off this evidence, but it is important that our definitive conclusions stay true to the nature of the experiment. The project also provided me with a more positive outlook on life. Relevant research topics based off of Project Kit Kat are listed below. We will now have a short intermission, and we will now continue. I wanted to list a few more advantages humans have over cats that were not covered by Project Kit Kat, along with bits of evidence to support these theories. A 2008 Harvard study found that, on average, humans are larger than cats. Cats exposed to a test used to assess proper development in toddlers reportedly performed below par on brushing teeth getting dressed, stacking blocks, drawing circles, and spelling words, and only excelled in climbing stairs. Thumbs and guns are self-explainable. We won't harp too much on those. An excerpt from the journal of a woman who survived the Hiroshima nuclear blast states, and I quote, "The blast killed all 5 of our cats. The initial shockwave instantly killed my mother, my father, and my older sister. Me and my younger brother were buried beneath the rubble of our house. For 3 days I listened to his whimpers. On the 4th day he fell silent, and on the 5th day I was pulled from the rubble. 20 years later I lay in my hospital bed, with only hours left before I succumbed to cancer of the thyroid, and all I can think is that this day came 20 years too late." End quote. The main takeaway here is nuclear bombs seem to have a similar, if not a slightly more deadly effect on cats compared to humans. And lastly, feline cell phone use has not increased since 1973. At this point, I have provided an abundance of evidence for my second proposal. We deserve respect, and there is no question about it. I will now move on to my final and most important proposal. I argue that we have a fundamental misunderstanding of our place in the world. This is a popular figure used by many to critique society today. The belief is that we currently have a worldview more similar to the ego on the left, and the implication is that we need to move towards a worldview that represents the eco, or species-wide communism, on the right. My belief is that our current system more resembles this image. We live in a world in which the advancement of our culture has led us to view ourselves as separate from the non-human inhabitants of the world. This thought process likely began with the development of farming, which is why I have labeled it the EIEIO. We give cats the benefit of the doubt because we don't apply the same rules to them as we do our fellow humans. This is why I argue that we need to advance from the EIEIO and embrace the ego. The ego ultimately represents a system in which humans accept and embrace our place as the dominant species of this planet. This particular depiction of the ego places women one level below men and on par with the humpback whale, but I certainly believe this is up for debate. I find it quite ironic that many of us not only believe the ego has already been attained, but that we also believe we need to revert from the ego to the eco. Reverting to the eco would be a slap to the face of our ancestors who experienced the harsh reality of the eco many centuries ago. We will run through a thought experiment to highlight the pathologic double standard that is currently present. Imagine you meet a guy named Mike. Maybe you met Mike when he was a baby. Maybe Mike strolled up to your door one day asking for some food. Either way, you take Mike into your residence, you feed Mike, you give Mike a place to sleep, you even take Mike to the doctor when he's sick. The well-being of Mike is almost completely in your hands. Despite this, Mike smacks the shit out of you 11 times a week. He walks on your keyboard when you're trying to work. You even worry for your kids' safety when they're around Mike. I'm pretty sure we would all change our opinion and treatment of Mike pretty quickly under these circumstances. The golden rule we all try to practice towards each other would quickly be replaced by the lesser-known silver rule with respect to our treatment of Mike. In other words, treat others how you would like to be treated would quickly turn into treat others how they treat you. None of us would put up with Mike for more than a few days under these circumstances, and none of us would have any second thoughts about dealing with Mike's behavior. This is something I think we can all agree on. The catch here is that Mike was a metaphor for a cat in this story. I would like you all to think about how you would have treated Mike differently if you knew he was a cat before I let you in on the secret. Unfortunately, many will excuse the actions of cats and other animals as natural behavior. The implication is that we cannot demonize the acts of animals because they are only doing what comes natural to them. I would like to provide you with a few examples from nature that may make some of you think differently about this topic. Killer whales use their tails to fling seals they have already caught more than 50 feet into the air. Scientists have not identified any potential advantage to this tactic, and it is commonly accepted that killer whales just do this for fun. But don't start feeling too bad for seals. Sexually frustrated male seals have sex with penguins when their tensions get too high. I have not included a picture of this. Elephants have been recorded knocking over entire trees simply so they can scratch their back in a position that is more convenient for them, or even for no reason at all. Sure, we can technically describe these actions as natural, but it should be clear at this point that not all animal behaviors are necessary for their survival. It can then be followed that we have no responsibility to accept these behaviors. How long will we continue to accept the current state of our relationship with cats? The EIEIO is responsible for this double standard, but embracing the ego allows us to throw all of this to the side and accept only what we want to accept. Standing atop the hierarchy gives us the control and removes our inhibitions. I would like to take a moment to honor the martyrs of this viewpoint. This will both further the understanding of our current situation and establish a place in history for those who have been forgotten. Michael Vick was imprisoned simply for observing a scuffle between two canines. He was put in prison for almost 2 years for an altercation he never threw a punch in, while the perpetrators were never put on trial or charged. The heroic acts of the Cincinnati Zoo resulted in the rescue of a young boy who had been kidnapped by a psychologically unstable gorilla. A large portion of the public completely ignored the successful outcome of the rescue mission and instead scrutinized the zoo for the means they used to secure the child. Colin Sherlock was arrested in 2010 for placing a cat in a microwave. He was ultimately sentenced for the act, even after making it clear in court that he was incredibly hungry at the time of the act. Here I have presented the same headlines presented earlier that highlight the outcomes of cat attacks on humans. Although these outcomes should certainly be taken into account, I want to be clear about one thing. At this point, I am making an argument of principle, and I see this as a potential turning point for our society. We must not revert to the ego of our ancestors. We must leave the EIEIO behind, and we must embrace the ego. On the left here is a potential logo for this movement, and on the right is an adaptation of the work of Robert Frost by yours truly that I feel exemplifies the nature of this movement. At this point, I hope you are all convinced that this is an issue we cannot ignore any longer, and I hope you are all wondering the same thing. What do we do now? To answer this question, I have one more proposal. I did not include it with the other three because it cannot be proven as true or correct, but I will present it as a potential blueprint for the future. I first proposed the establishment of Patatas Katab, or People Against the Ethical Treatment of Animals, specifically cats, unless they treat us better. This organization will function as a political action committee. Patatas Katab will then lobby Congress with the intent of having our plan, also known as the Cat Act, put into action. Upon the passing of the Cat Act, there will be a 1-year period of data gathering. This will allow us to establish baseline numbers on cats when it comes to the quantity and severity of attacks. Upon the completion of the first year, we will pass a law requiring all cat owners to practice the 3-strike policy. The 3-strike policy is a corrective measure for cat behavior. It consists of a series of kicks with increasing intensities in response to cat behavior. The first time a cat acts out under this policy, its owner will be required to kick the cat with a force equal to the average full intensity kick of a 4-year-old child. The second time the cat acts out, the owner will be required to kick the cat with a force equal to the average full intensity kick of a 10-year-old child. The third violation will result in a full force kick by the owner. If the cat survives and continues to act out, all successive kicks will be full force. Patatas Katab will sell kicking robots at this time. The robots will be programmed to accurately perform all three stages of kicks. They will be sold to cat owners who are unsure of the appropriate force to be used for each kick, and the proceeds will be used to fund Pateta Skata. A year after the implementation of the three-strike policy, we will evaluate its success. The three-strike policy will be considered successful if cat attacks fall to a level of 30% below the baseline measured in the previous year. If the three-strike policy is successful, it will be re-implemented for another year. If the three-strike policy is unsuccessful, we will move into phase 2 of the plan. First, we will use cat records gathered over the previous year to identify every cat in the country as either good or bad. A cat will be considered good if it has 0 attacks on its record or 1 attack that can be reasonably explained as a misunderstanding. A cat will be considered bad if it has 1 or more attacks that cannot be explained as misunderstandings. Cats identified as good will be borrowed from their owners and shipped to a private facility where we will perform cat eugenics to create a population of non-aggressive cats. Cats identified as bad will be removed from their owners and shipped to a different private facility where we will commit genocide against the violent cat population. Any owner who loses a cat to this process will be supplied with a cat from the eugenics program. A likely requirement of Stage 2 will be eliminating detractors, and I will list the likely top targets. The first is PETA for obvious reasons. The next will be any makers of PETA products in case there is any overlap there. And the last is Joe Exotic. Though radical, Phase 2 is a necessary step if the three-strike policy fails, and it would undoubtedly serve as a successful means of altering our cat population to better fit our needs and desires. I would like my earliest followers to be my most committed. With this in mind, I've hidden my personal information somewhere in the continental United States, and I have written a cryptic poem that reveals its location. I will read that poem now. Onward, now is the time to fight. Walk out of your door and take a right. Walk as many paces as the wind blows that day. Now walk back to your house. You went the wrong way. Thank you all for listening to my lecture on the audacity of cats. Again, I am Wombat McStiffens, and if you have any questions, you can try to figure out the answer on your own.